On January 29th, 2010, Captain Phil Harris was doing what he'd done 1,000 times before, offloading king crab from the Cornelia in Dutch Harbor, Alaska. He'd just finished another brutal season on Deadliest Catch, one of the most dangerous jobs on Earth. His sons Josh and Jake were right there with him. The cameras were rolling. Everything seemed routine. And then, without warning, Phil collapsed. What happened next would become the most devastating storyline in Deadliest Catch history. Because Phil Harris, the chain-smoking cowboy boot legend who'd survived 30 years of Bering Sea storms, wouldn't survive this. 12 days later, his sons would make a decision no child should ever have to make, and the entire fishing world would watch as one of their greatest captains slipped away. This is the story of Phil Harris's final days. The stroke that blindsided his family, the agonizing choice his sons faced, and how Deadliest Catch captured one of the most painfully real moments ever broadcast on television. But to understand why his death hit so hard, you need to understand who Phil Harris really was. Phil Harris wasn't just another crab boat captain. It was Deadliest Catch. Royalty from the moment the show premiered in 2005, while other captains were all business. Phil was the guy cracking jokes in the wheelhouse, chain-smoking Marlboros, and wearing cowboy boots on a fishing vessel. He had a personality that jumped through the screen. Fans didn't just respect him, they genuinely loved him. He'd been fishing the Bering Sea since he was a teenager, following in his father's footsteps. By the time Discovery Channel started filming Deadliest Catch, Phil had been running the Cornelia for years, and he'd built a reputation as one of the best. He knew how to find crab when other boats came up empty. He knew how to push his crew without breaking them. And he had something most captains didn't: his two sons working beside him. Josh and Jake Harris grew up on that boat. Phil was teaching them the same way his father had taught him, through brutal or hands-on experience in some of the most dangerous waters on the planet. Deadliest Catch cameras captured that relationship in all its complexity. The pride Phil felt watching his boys grow into fishermen. The frustration when they screwed up. The unspoken bond that only comes from surviving storms together. But there was something else the cameras captured too. Something that would become impossible to ignore as the seasons went on. Phil's health was failing, and everyone could see it. By 2009, fans watching Deadliest Catch had started to notice that Phil didn't look right. He was constantly out of breath. His face was red. He'd gained weight, and he was smoking more than ever, sometimes 2 packs a day. Other captains, even the crew, would tell him to slow down, to take care of himself. Phil would wave them off with a joke and light another cigarette. He was a fisherman. Fishermen don't quit. They don't take breaks. They work until the job is done. But the Bering Sea has a way of collecting debts, and Phil's was about to come due. The 2009 to 2010 opilio crab season had been brutal for everyone. Captains across the Deadliest Catch fleet were grinding through mechanical failures, injuries, and some of the worst weather in years. There were moments when boats had to abandon ship protocols ready, when waves were so massive that survival seemed like luck rather than skill. But Phil and the Cornelia had pushed through. They'd brought in a solid catch, not the biggest catch on record, but enough to make the season profitable. By late January 2010, they were back in Dutch Harbor, offloading crab and preparing to head home. Phil was exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that comes from weeks of 3-hour sleep shifts, chain smoking through anxiety, and carrying the weight of keeping a crew alive in conditions that kill people regularly. On January 29th, as the crew was offloading the last of their king crab, Phil suddenly stopped mid-conversation. His speech slurred. He reached for something to steady himself, and then he collapsed right there on the dock. Josh and Jake were the first ones to him. They immediately knew this wasn't just exhaustion or dehydration. This was something catastrophic. Phil was rushed to Anchorage, where doctors confirmed what everyone feared. He'd suffered a massive stroke. The kind of stroke that happens when years of high blood pressure, stress, smoking, and lack of sleep finally catch up to you all at once. They performed emergency surgery to relieve the pressure on his brain. For a few days, there was hope. Phil was a fighter. He'd survived decades. In the Bering Sea. Surely he could survive this. But strokes don't care about your reputation. They don't care how tough you are or how many storms you've weathered. Phil's condition wasn't improving, and his sons were about to face a nightmare that no amount of Deadliest Catch training could prepare them for. What happened next would become one of the most gut-wrenching sequences ever filmed for television. Because Discovery Channel cameras were there. They'd been embedded with the Harris family for years. And when Phil's condition deteriorated, Josh and Jake made a decision that shocked everyone. They let the cameras keep rolling. For nearly 2 weeks, Phil Harris clung to life in an Anchorage hospital. Josh and Jake rarely left his side. The entire Deadliest Catch, community captains, crew members, producers, was holding its breath, hoping for a miracle. Sig Hansen flew in to be with the family. Other captains called constantly. The fishing world was rallying around Phil, because everyone in that community understood this could happen to any of them. The Bering Sea might not have taken Phil directly, but 30 years of that lifestyle absolutely had. But by early February, the doctors delivered devastating news. The damage from the stroke was too severe. Phil wasn't going to recover. He was being kept alive by machines. And the man who'd lived his entire life on his own terms was now completely dependent on technology to breathe. Josh and Jake had to make a choice. And it was the hardest choice any child ever faces. On February 9, 2010, 12 days after his stroke, the Harris brothers made the decision to remove their father from life support. And here's what made this moment different from every other reality TV death or tragedy. Discovery Channel aired it. They showed Josh and Jake in that hospital room, saying goodbye to their father. They showed the raw grief, the devastating finality, the moment when the machines were turned off and Phil Harris took his last breath. Some people criticized Discovery for airing it. They said it was exploitative, that the family's private tragedy shouldn't have been turned into television content. But Josh and Jake Harris defended the decision. They said their father lived his life on camera, taught them the fishing trade on camera, and they wanted his death to be real too. No Hollywood ending, no sanitized version. Just the truth of what happens when this lifestyle catches up to you. Phil Harris died at 53 years old. A man who'd survived countless Bering Sea storms, mechanical failures, and moments when his crew had to prepare to abandon ship in freezing waters, taken out by his own body finally giving up. The news hit the fishing community like a shockwave. Captains who'd competed against Phil for decades openly wept. Crew members who'd worked under him shared stories. And fans of Deadliest Catch mourned like they'd lost someone they actually knew, because in a way, they had. Phil Harris had been in their living rooms for 5 seasons. They'd watched him laugh, yell, celebrate, and struggle. They'd watched him teach his sons. They'd watched him live. And now they'd watched him die. But his death would change Deadliest Catch forever. And what it meant for Josh and Jake, that story was just beginning. Deadliest Catch dedicated an entire episode to Phil Harris's death. It aired on July 20th, 2010, and it didn't hold back. The episode showed everything. The collapse, the hospital vigil, the decision to remove life support, and the funeral. Over 8 million people watched. It became one of the highest-rated episodes in the show's history. But for Josh and Jake Harris, the real struggle was just starting. Because they didn't just lose their father, they lost their captain, their teacher, and their anchor in an industry that doesn't forgive weakness. The question everyone was asking, what happens to the Cornelia Marie now? Phil Harris had been the Cornelia Marie. His personality, his reputation, his relationships with buyers and crews, that's what made that boat successful. Without him, the future was uncertain. Josh and Jake wanted to keep the boat running, too. Honor their father's legacy. But neither of them was ready to be captain yet. They were skilled deckhands, but running a boat in the Bering Sea requires years of experience they simply didn't have. The Cornelia Marie eventually returned to fishing, but with different captains. Josh and Jake worked on other boats, trying to build their own reputations outside of their father's shadow. It was messy, it was painful, and it played out on Deadliest Catch cameras for seasons afterward. Jake struggled particularly hard. He battled addiction, had run-ins with the law, and eventually stepped away from fishing altogether for several years. The loss of his father had broken something in him that fishing couldn't fix. Josh stayed in the industry longer, but eventually he too stepped back from the grueling Bering Sea seasons. In 2017, 7 years after Phil's death, the Harris brothers made a decision. They sold the Cornelia Marie, the boat that their father had commanded. That had been their home. That represented everything Phil Harris stood for. It was time to let it go. Today, Phil Harris remains one of the most beloved figures in Deadliest Catch history. Fans still talk about his best moments, the deadliest catch, biggest catch hauls he brought in, the storms he navigated, the one-liners he delivered in the wheelhouse. But his death also served as a brutal reminder of what this job actually costs. Deadliest Catch is entertaining television, but it documents an industry with one of the highest mortality rates in America. Fishermen don't just die in dramatic, abandoned ship scenarios when boats sink in storms. They die from strokes at 53. They die from heart attacks. They die from bodies that have been pushed beyond human limits for decades. Phil's death changed how Deadliest Catch approached safety and health. Captains started taking medical screenings more seriously. Crew members started having conversations about the long-term cost of this lifestyle. And the show itself became more honest about the toll. They stopped glamorizing the cowboy mentality that kills fishermen. They started showing the reality. This job will break your body, and if you're not careful, it will kill you. For Josh and Jake Harris, their fathers, legacy is complicated. They lost him too young. They've struggled to find their own paths, but they've also spoken openly about how grateful they are that his life and his death were documented. Because Phil Harris didn't die in anonymity, he died as a legend, and millions of people got to see exactly what this life demands and what it takes from the people who choose it. Captain Phil Harris survived 30 years in the Bering Sea. He navigated storms that sank other boats. He brought in catches that other captains could only dream of. He built a legacy on Deadliest Catch that will never be forgotten. But in the end, the danger didn't come from the waves, or the ice, or the equipment failures. It came from within. From the cigarettes, the stress, the high blood pressure, the lifestyle that grinds fishermen down until there's nothing left. Phil knew the risks. He joked about them constantly. And he lived exactly how he wanted to live right up until the moment his body said no more. Do you think Discovery Channel made the right call airing Phil's final moments? Or should some things remain private, even for reality TV stars? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear about the other major Deadliest Catch tragedies, including the boats that actually did sink, and the captains who barely made it out alive, hit that subscribe button. Because the Bering Sea has taken more than just Phil Harris. And those stories need to be told too. Rest in peace, Captain Phil. The Bering Sea misses you.